Courtney, I'm very happy to see you here this morning in Washington, D.C., so it's still early morning, and here in Berlin it's already after or almost 2 o'clock. Courtney Federico works for the political desk at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee in the so-called independent expenditure. And she's doing data analysis there and crafting polls to create messaging campaigns for TV, for radio, for digital advertising. So we're very pleased to have you here. Also, on top of that, she worked in 2019 for the presidential candidates Kirsten Gillibrand before she dropped out, and also Kamala Harris. So we have a very great guest here on the panel. And the other guest is Annett Meiritz. As you probably read, she's a journalist and has been US correspondent to the German newspaper Handelsblatt. Oh, she's coming now. So hello, Annett Meiritz. Can you hear us?
Yes, I'm sorry that I'm a little bit late. We had a few technical problems and I just blame the US government.
I'm sure you're right about that. So yeah, welcome Annett Meiritz. I just introduced Courtney Federico to the audience. She's working for the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And I also told the audience that you are a journalist. Many of the participants might even know you from reading you on Spiegel Online in former times, and now in Handelsblatt, where you're US correspondent for 3.5 years. Both of you live in Washington, D.C. So it's the early morning, and yeah, I'm very happy to have you here in this panel right now. My name is Monaghan. I work as head of marketing and communication at Universum AG here in Berlin. Yeah, I will start with the panel then. You probably remember we was talking about before Biden was the Democratic Party nominee for president, billionaire and former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg also tried to get elected for a few months, and he invested, as I read, over $1 billion US in only those few months that he actually ran for office. And that is, just to give you an idea, about 10 times as much as all German parties together invested in the 2017 federal election campaign. What does that show us? First of all, I guess money alone does not do the job. It doesn't make you get elected. Secondly, but there's in the US, there's a lot of money involved, and a lot of money. That means, on the one hand, obviously that you have a lot of resources and a certain or a different level of professionalism, I would call it, if you compare German campaigns, political campaigns, to American campaigns. And therefore, I think for anyone involved in political campaigning, the US is just one of the most important points of reference, and that is the reason why we are meeting up right now, because we are looking forward to learn more about the US campaign that is just behind us. This conference focuses on the digital side of campaigning and campaigns, but I would like to start with some general observations. On the one hand, we had Joe Biden, who got off with a bumpy start. He was being elected 5th in February in the primaries, and only in Super Tuesday he passed Sanders before many people didn't even expect him to actually get elected the nominee. And Trump, on the other hand, in last February still was in his glory when he wins over the first impeachment trial against him, and the economy is humming, donations are at record levels. And then COVID changed the whole setup. Trump was downplaying the crisis, called it, I think, even a democratic hoax, Chinese disease, and then and even promotes these miracle cures, like some medicines that were on the market and might help, but he tries mainly to downsize it. Whereas Biden, he goes down to his cellar and does his campaign from his studio there, as I read, and sometimes meets like 5 or 10 people, whereas Trump still met like in airfields with thousands of people. Annett Meiritz, you've been observing the US campaign from a German journalist's perspective. What would you call the turning points in the campaign? Why did Joe Biden win in the end?
That's a good question. I was thinking about that as well, because when I look back, I can't really see that one turning point. It was kind of a slow buildup of political movement, because Joe Biden was very, very consequent and very straight in his message. He wanted to gain the trust of the people back. He wanted to restore the soul of the nation. And this message was like spot on, and he never really made a mistake during the campaign. Like, I don't want to idolize him here. Like, he just played it safe from my point of view. And on the other hand, Trump did I remember that I went to the hospital when Trump actually had caught COVID, and he had this tour with his with a presidential car and was raving to everyone. I was standing there and I was like, okay, is this really an election campaign, or are we in a reality show? And so you had this huge contrast between Trump, the as ever show maker, and on the other hand, Biden with this constant, really, I'm the trustworthy guy message. And so there never was really a dramatic turning point. But it was always the two sides kind of drifting apart. That's how I felt it. And I'm very curious to hear maybe how you, Courtney, saw it, but that's what I felt.
I completely agree.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, the election wasn't called until a while after Election Day. So we really didn't know how it would shake out for days after the election. So it really was close until the very end.
What do you think, or Courtney, can you tell us more? Because as I understood it in the last weeks, at least, Joe Biden was a lot ahead of Trump. But in the end, it was very, very close, and you had to wait so long. Why was that? Like, why did Joe Biden win so close in the end? Do you have any explanation for that?
I'm sure that everyone who follows American politics knows about our challenges with polling. We often have polls. This happened in 2016 as well. We thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. The polling indicated that she did not ultimately. So I think some polls certainly had Joe Biden leading. At the end of the election, the polls had a lot of Democrats leading. I was working on House races at the time. Many of my candidates were leading in the polls at that time, and they ultimately did not win. So we have a polling issue here to deal with. I think polling, we've learned, it shows maybe a moment in time, but it's not predictive of the future. And we also know that there are some sampling problems. Maybe people are not answering truthfully. Maybe this is only specific to Trump. And when Trump is on the ballot, we are running into these polling issues. So that is a big question that we are trying to figure out. But I would say that it was close always. It was neck and neck until the very end. I think the polling was, from a Democrat's perspective, optimistic for us at the end.
Annett Meiritz, I also read that critics say that in itself, it was not really a unifying theme of it, other than Trump must go from the side of the Democratic Party. Would you agree on that? That it was just this one message in the end that helped Joe Biden win the election. Also, even when he nominated Kamala Harris, it didn't make such a big difference in votes. Like, it didn't mobilize so many. Some critics say that she with her academic background as a tough prosecutor, she was just not the right, or she was a good candidate, a good person on the side of him, but she was just not mobilizing enough voters.
Very good points. The interesting thing when I look back is that at the very beginning, when we had the many Democratic candidates, like before it was clear that Joe Biden is going to be nominated, none of the candidates really wanted to take Trump's name in their mouth. Like everyone was avoiding the Trump topic, which was a little bit strange because he was the president. So, but everyone tried to be, you know, focused on topics and focused on policy. And then that changed a lot. Like the further the race went, like more Democrats focused on we have to mobilize. I'm sorry, this is a cat here. We have to mobilize. With the resistance against Trump. And I think the unifying theme, of course, was the pandemic. Like on the one hand, like it wasn't, of course, unifying because there are two polarizing fractions within the US. I'm sorry, fractions within the US. Like one hand didn't take the COVID pandemic seriously, the other hand did. And so Biden in the end very much tried to focus on that message to bring the country back to prosperity. And I think that was a huge factor as well, I guess. Just one little sentence to Kamala Harris. I still think it was a smart move because it showed that he's able to forgive her for the attacks in the election campaign. So it made a really unified theme of the party itself. And she, of course, with the diversity aspect, that was super important for the whole country. So I think it was like kind of on a lower level, it was important for the campaign.
We just briefly mentioned the campaigns in America. For us, it's even like, or I found it kind of surprising that in America, Trump used rallies, like the big rallies where a lot of people would meet up, the so-called Wahlkampfveranstaltung, Großveranstaltung, which I didn't, just when I started preparing even this panel, I just remembered, because in Germany, this hasn't taken place in a long time, any party conventions. So Biden in the end used car rallies, like Autoveranstaltungen in cinemas and so on. And that is, of course, like one way to really mobilize and get in touch with voters and supporters. On the other hand, you used, of course, especially you, Courtney, with your teams or other people like you for the candidate, traditional television, streaming television, social media, general advertising. What would you say, Courtney, is the Democrats' best practice there currently? What's your advice for a political organization to focus on if you have, let's put it, €1,000 or $1,000, $1 million? How would you divide that up?
It's interesting because last cycle was very different for Democrats. We typically focus significantly on the ground game, the field operation. We have field organizers typically across the country knocking doors, making phone calls, engaging in voter contact face-to-face. That's a critical piece of work for Democratic campaigns and something that I think we really emphasize over Republicans typically. Last cycle, we were unable to do that because of the pandemic for a long time. Joe Biden started canvassing 1 month before the election. And typically you start canvassing in the spring or at latest the early summer. So a lot of the voter communication last cycle was moved online or was moved on TV, radio. So we certainly, I think the party as a whole invested more money in TV, in radio, in digital than we would in other cycles, given the pandemic and everything that was going on. But typically, I think, TV is the most expensive. It also reaches the most people. It's not as targeted. Traditional TV is not as targeted. So you have to have one message that, plays well among different groups of people, different age groups, both genders, all genders. And that is what runs on TV. Now with here in the States, we have streaming TV like Hulu where we can advertise. We're able to run much more targeted messaging that way. It's kind of like TV and digital have come together, and we have the targeting aspects of digital, but we have the wide reach of TV to do it that way. So we can run more targeted messaging that way. But there was a greater emphasis, at least at the DCCC, on digital this last cycle. I think that we certainly are shifting more in the direction of digital and advertising there, and pulling away from TV, especially younger people here in the States are moving more to streaming TV and away from cable. So that more money is being invested in digital. There's a lot more time and energy being put into being creative and eye-catching on digital. So, and then radio also plays a role, but I think that also continues to shrink. And last year during the pandemic, we didn't know how much time people were spending listening to radio, because we typically would target drive time radio when people are commuting to work, which many people were not doing because of the pandemic. So I would say if I did have a bucket of money, that percentage that's being dedicated to digital continues to grow with every cycle, and everything else I think kind of decreases.
Okay. Annett, Ms. Meiritz, how did you experience the election, as you probably were as a non-US citizen, and maybe with a German citizenship, and also with like maybe German settings on your computer, you're probably less targeted than other US citizens. How digital was it for yourself, or how digital did you experience it? What did other people tell you? Did they get a lot more, or did they tell you that they got a lot more ads digitally? What would you say?
Yeah, that's interesting. Probably it's a bit of an exception for the German, or for every foreign journalist, because we are in DC, so the Republicans don't advertise here that much because it's all like, I don't know, 96% voting for the Democrats. And the Democrats don't really have to advertise that much because they already have DC. So maybe that's an exception. But I can only tell from my personal experience that I have a few very engaged friends and neighbors who went to Virginia and to Maryland to do more the traditional stuff like phone banking, canvassing, knocking on doors. And so I learned a little bit, I mean, Courtney knows much more about this, but the feeling of the, for me as a German, that the Americans do the grassroots, the grassroots campaigns, they take it really seriously. And in Germany, I mean, as much as I love Germany, but sometimes people there are a little, oh my God, I have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to to get out the message. Maybe let's do it later. And the Americans are full in, like they drop their job if it has to be, if it's necessary. They cancel barbecues. They go out. They're full in their political message, and they're very engaged on a private citizen level. So this, for me as a German, is very impressive. That when they have a goal, they just do it, and they don't need anyone to tell them.
So they're more driven than German campaigners. That's very interesting, right? Very interesting observation. Let's see how it's going to be here this autumn for the 2021 campaign in Germany. Another question I have is, or what you can read is some experts say that American elections campaigns run more than in Germany under the questions, am I better off than I was 4 years ago? That this personal perspective is very important for actually voting for this or that party. And some say that in this election, however, the image of the US abroad played a much more important role, more decisive role than it traditionally does, of course, in favorite, maybe, of course, in favorite for the Democrats. And is that also your observation? Was the image of the US abroad of the election decisive issue for many people? Or if not, what would you say were decisive issues? Or would you say it was just COVID?
Immigration is a decisive issue still, probably always will be. Abortion, guns. That is like whenever I leave DC, it's very healthy to leave the Washington bubble. So whenever I do this, like the economy, of course, the economy is important, but it's not like the topics that really get the, people talk in the evening with their families about. There are other topics of jobs, immigration, abortion, guns, the topics that really, that gets to the core of the American freedom, I would say, and how people define American freedom. That's why the mask theme was so important here. Is a mask a restriction or is it a protection? And that's very interesting to see as a European as well.
Okay, I see you agree. Courtney.
Something I would add to that is, and something we have not touched on, is race. Something that also happened in the States last year, in addition to the pandemic, was an unprecedented racial reckoning in this country. And this is something we continue to struggle with. But the murder of George Floyd unleashed, an incredible movement that we haven't seen before across the country. And so I think the role of Black voters here in America cannot be understated. I think, Joe Biden won because of Black voters in this country. When we were looking at Georgia, it was Black voters who delivered Georgia for Joe Biden. And so this was also another incredible topical issue that was happening in the States during the election. And Nina, your question of, am I better off than 4 years ago? I think a lot of Black Americans were asking themselves that question and looking at what Joe Biden was offering, having Kamala Harris on his ticket. I think a lot of Black voters saw Joe Biden and his candidacy and Kamala Harris as a brighter future than the country under Trump.
Okay. I also read that Trump voters are structurally unhappier than Democratic voters. Like they're more skeptical, they're more or generally easier to irritate. Have been some studies about that. Find it very interesting. And the reason, this study said, is because they have no hope that their personal situation will change to the better anytime soon. Would you agree to this? And Courtney, and are they unhappier, or are Democratic voters happier? And if it is so, is it anything you consider when you create content, when you create ads, that you talk to people that are maybe more self-confident, happier, better off?
This is interesting. As a Democrat, I am biased. I would love to say that all Democrats are happier and, thriving in the world compared to Republicans. But I do think
saying everyone, but
a critical difference between, I think, the parties and the way that leaders in the party message to their voters is, I think Republicans, far more than Democrats, I don't think we typically use this tactic, but I think Republicans often mobilize their voters through fear. I think when you look at immigration, that it's framed in a sense of people are coming to take your jobs, people are coming to change your way of life, and you need to vote in order to prevent that from happening. So I think it's fear that is used to mobilize voters on the right. So it would not surprise me to know that voters are on that side do feel maybe a little less satisfaction or happiness. I think Donald Trump's Make America Great Again, he's suggesting this idea of holding on to a time that has passed. And maybe for his core voters, these could be people, we look at the Rust Belt. We've had so many conversations in the States about the Rust Belt, the Michigan, Wisconsin, that whole area that went to Trump in 2016, that shocked everyone, mostly the Democrats, because they had typically voted for Democrats before. There's a conversation around the white working class. And I think that the Republicans have done a great job of messaging to that group of people to say, you need to vote to preserve the lifestyle that you used to have that has been lost to all of these different progressive issues, immigration being one, a number of ideals that progressives uphold. The Republicans have done a good job of framing that in a way that makes some voters feel like they should be afraid of progress. And so I can certainly imagine that having an impact on how hopeful people feel about the state of the country and the future.
Okay. Frau Meiritz, I read that you were recently in Florida. And Florida, for US citizens, perhaps not everyone knows that here is like the retirees' paradise. So many retirees live there. There's a good climate, lots of golf courses. It's a good place to live when you're older. Why did so many eyes turn on this state during the election campaign? Why is that an important state for US campaigns?
It used to be a so-called swing state, and it's more and more turning red. And for me, or not for me, for like every expert, it's getting the new like epicenter of the Republican Party. Not just only because Trump is living there now at his Mar-a-Lago resort. But what is interesting in the pandemic, like the governor Ron DeSantis, we really have to watch him. He might play a very important role in the future. He kept the state open, and like to a point where when you went there, like you were like, oh my God, is the pandemic even still existing? Like basically outside, no one was wearing masks and basically no restrictions anywhere. So he kept the economy open, he kept everything open. And so Florida kind of right now stands for a symbol of an alternative way in the pandemic. That doesn't mean that they had a lot of like more than 30,000 people dying of COVID as well. So, but they kind of traded off the keeping the economy open. And that was their way of handling the pandemic. And political wise, it's very interesting that the Republicans kind of, that they show that with the Latin votes, there are many Latins living there in Florida, and increasingly younger people living there, that they show that they can kind of grab a huge state like Florida for themselves. It's very interesting what's happening there. But other states like Georgia, they are flipping blue. So we have different tendencies here.
So Courtney, what role does Florida play for you? I mean, have you given up that state? It's just now it's red, so it's gone. Or what are the measures to actually address people there? I mean, what do you think about? What do Americans think about micro-targeting, especially after Cambridge Analytica? I mean, you've been working especially on competitive congressional districts, so districts that were very close between Democrats and Republicans. Wouldn't it make sense to show and send out an ad there about health insurance, especially to retirees or to Latins that have like their matter to win the state back? What are you doing?
I do not think Florida is lost to us. Of course, I'm optimistic and I'm unwilling to give away one of our important states. But I do think a critical piece about Florida, and we saw this nationally in last year's election, is the way of Hispanic voters. We saw many of them vote for Trump, which is incredibly surprising. You'll remember the day Donald Trump announced his candidacy in 2015, you know, in those first weeks, he said a number of horrible things about people from Mexico. He did perpetuate that throughout the course of his administration. But we saw a number of Hispanics vote for Donald Trump, and that was certainly the case in Florida. That's a critical voting bloc for Democrats in Florida. We typically, we've had success with this group of voters in the past. So I do not think that they are lost. I think that our party needs to figure out what we are doing wrong in messaging to this group, and not just messaging, but policy as well, and understand why we're losing ground there in order to win those voters back. There are certainly pockets, of course, in every state, well, many states, there are pockets of liberals who live in Florida, especially Southern Florida. A lot of there are some blue state folks who have gone down to retire in Florida, as you mentioned. And so we haven't lost everyone there just yet, but we do need to, the party certainly needs to figure out what happened and how we lost Hispanic voters so significantly. That's the critical piece, I think, to holding on to Florida.
Okay. So you say like it's an overall job. It's not just micro-targeting. Do I get it right? You just don't. It's not enough to just show them the right ad. You just have to, maybe the whole approach, the whole way to speak to these groups has to change. I'm just curious because in Germany, this is a topic that's often discussed, often criticized for manipulating people in a way that is not right. What I just found interesting in the US, this is, I think that you are a step ahead of what we're doing here in Germany, what I've seen. Like here in Germany, it's usually just online targeting. So I'm a female, so I get certain ads, whereas some other, a man would get a different ad, or someone older gets a different ad than someone younger, according to my interests maybe. But what I've seen in the States, what I find very interesting is there happening a more and more symbiosis between online and offline targeting, and talk like about Bluetooth signs in front yards that are being disposed. Like I will get a different, whenever I pass that front yard with my car or passing by, I will see a certain ad, or if I leave a church or if I leave a gun shop, I will see a certain ad. So what's your opinion about that? Have you ever seen this, Annett? What do you think about it? Is it the right thing to do? Is it just modernization, or is it difficult? Is it problematic? What do you think?
I think that the party advertising is important, and the targeted advertising I do think is important, but it needs to be one element in a larger ecosystem to persuade voters. I think that targeting is incredibly useful. I think that there are different messages that move different groups of people. In my work at Emily's List, we talked a lot about abortion and women's access to reproductive health. And so that would typically be a pretty targeted message, since we know that abortion, is one of those hot topics that people feel very strongly about. So that would be pushed out in a targeted way to people that we think would be receptive to that messaging. So I think targeting is useful. You will hear from every campaign, Democratic or Republican here in the States, that the strategy around advertising and messaging is driven by data. People are very excited about data and using that to be more targeted. But I do think there are limitations. The data that we have is not always correct, especially I think around demographics. We do not always have the correct information. And I think polling shows that we can't cleanly put groups of people into specific blocks and think that they are going to react a certain way. And so that makes me believe that while targeting is helpful and should be utilized, we also should take a step back and do some broad messaging to make sure that we're reaching as many people as possible, even the people who data may not indicate are with us, because they exist out there.
What's your opinion about that, Annett Meiritz?
No, I just thought it's super interesting, and it reminded me of the debate in journalism, because we are measuring everything, like everything. And of course, there is the debate to take a step back and to, the data is very precious and super important, but sometimes your brain is important too. So I thought that was very interesting what you described there, and that there is like kind of, in the end, it's a balance, right? Yeah.
There's also scientists talking about it. Some of them say it's not even so effective to target people, because you can't look inside the person's head. What is the decisive matter to that person? Only because the person is 40 years old or 50 years old, or 60 years old, you don't know what makes the person vote for this or another party. As an observer here in Germany, I was following the election campaign primarily via email marketing. So I got emails from Donald Trump every day, signed by him, signed by Joe Biden every day, in 99.9% of the cases. And very quickly, I was asked to make a donation. I'm very curious, Courtney, how effective is that? I got very bored very, very quickly, but I'm happy to find out it's very effective.
Yes, it is effective. And especially for Democrats, especially during the Democratic primary, Democrats like to tout their average donation. And so it's usually through grassroots. Like Bernie Sanders, I think, really made this famous. And he had so many grassroots supporters who would donate $5, small amounts online. And so he could go then and say, I'm a candidate of the people. My average donation is $15. I'm not taking money from, these wealthy people, corporations, which is very much his brand and the basis of his candidacy. So I do think the online fundraising does serve two purposes. I don't think it's necessarily max out checks that are coming through these email fundraising campaigns, but especially for Democrats, those grassroots donations are valuable. And that's a metric that they use often in communicating with Democratic voters, and something that they are very proud of, that their campaign is judged based upon. So it serves those two purposes. For Republicans, I'm not as knowledgeable about how useful it is for them, but I also think when one party does something, the other one has to do it as well in order to stay competitive. So those are my thoughts on those emails, which I also receive, and sometimes they can be a little out there.
I was just surprised to get it like every day. I would get this email, please donate $5 here, $10 for this reason, and $15 for that reason. And I also saw that at the DCC, you also send out more of a variety. Sometimes it's polling, and I found it more interactive, it was more appealing to me to be asked about what I think about issues, or what I think about candidates, about personnel in the end. Is that something that you actually use for your campaigns, or is it kind of a fake participation that I just participate because the answer it's also true that at the end of the poll I'm also asked to make a donation.
I think I can't say for certain, but I do think it is fake to a certain extent. Yeah. I think the DCCC in particular is famous for sending these crazy, kinds of emails, these crazy kinds of subject lines. And, with all of these emails, people are looking for engagement. If you will click something in the email, chances that you will donate increase. So they're always looking for ways to reel you in, I think, across all of these email fundraising campaigns.
Okay, very interesting. I think we are now at the end of the time, actually, with being at 2:30. I don't see any questions of the audience. I would say, Courtney, Annett Meiritz, thank you very much for joining the discussion, being here, sharing your experiences, and thank you for your expertise. I hope you, the viewers here right now, got as much out of the conversation as I did. And I would like to hand over, therefore, to Hilma Sattler, head of the Capital Office of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation here in Berlin. So Hilma, ich würde dir das Wort übergeben für ein kleines Fazit, einen Ausblick.
Ja, vielen Dank, Nina. Liebe Teilnehmerinnen, liebe Teilnehmer der heutigen Digital Campaigning Konferenz. Ich danke Ihnen allen ganz herzlich für Ihre heutige Teilnahme. Mein Name ist Hilma Sattler, ich leite das Hauptstadtbüro der Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung und freue mich, dass wir heute so spannende 4,5 Stunden hatten. Heute Morgen um 10 Uhr war ich gespannt, nervös und voller Erwartung auf die heutige Konferenz. Was erwartet uns? Klappt auch alles technisch. Und ich glaube, nach nun 4,5 Stunden stelle ich fest, dass wir spannende Diskussionen und interessante Persönlichkeiten und auch tolle Einblicke erleben durften. Ich glaube, jetzt halt das hier irgendwo. Kann das sein?
Okay.
Gut, dann machen wir weiter. Ich sage das halt. Zudem, glaube ich, kann jeder von uns spannende Impulse für seine Arbeit mitnehmen, für sein tägliches Tun. Und ich glaube, wie Professor Brettschneider heute sagte, das war beim ersten Part heute, die Partitur muss. Ich glaube, die Partitur hat heute gestimmt. Für diese erfolgreiche Partitur bzw. Konferenz möchte ich ganz herzlich erstmal allen Gästen danken, auf dem Panel sowie unseren Moderatorinnen. Dir, liebe Nina, du bist ja hier noch bei mir. Frau Pfeffermann, ebenso wie Dr. Anna Schwan und unser Moderator Karl-Philipp Burkhardt. Ich glaube, das war heute toll auch moderiert, die Panels. Bedanken möchte ich mich auch für die technische Unterstützung beim Universum-Team und für den tollen Einsatz. Wenn es hier und da einmal gehakt haben sollte, bitte ich jetzt schon unsere Konferenzteilnehmer, das zu verzeihen. Bei einem solchen Projekt kann es immer mal kommen, dass sich jemand verspätet, dass der Einwahl nicht funktioniert. Da bitte ich wirklich um Nachsichtigkeit. Ihnen, liebe Gäste, möchte ich nochmal herzlich für die Teilnahme danken und freue mich auf die Fortsetzung dieses Formats, weil ich glaube, dieses Format war toll, war spannend und gibt auch in der Zukunft viele weitere Möglichkeiten, in den Austausch zu kommen. Diesen Austausch würde ich mir natürlich lieber persönlich wünschen, so wie wir das vor der Pandemie gewohnt waren. Und ich hoffe, dass wir bald wieder so weit sind, dass wir miteinander live persönlich kommen und diskutieren können. Das würde mich zumindest freuen. Ich wünsche Ihnen jetzt noch einen angenehmen Nachmittag. Bleiben Sie gesund und hoffentlich bis bald bei der Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung. Vielen Dank.
Sie ist nicht immer leicht zu erkennen. Sie kann so aussehen, aber auch so. Sie kann eine Zumutung sein, aber auch die Verantwortung, die wir tragen. Und wenn sie für die einen das ist und für andere das, dann kann sie auch darin bestehen, einfach nur füreinander da zu sein. Sie wird uns nicht geschenkt, aber wir wissen, wo wir sie finden. Wie sie sich anfühlt, wie sie schmeckt und wie sie klingt, wenn wir sie endlich erreicht haben. Sie bedeutet nicht für alle dasselbe, aber vielen bedeutet sie alles. Und wenn wir gemeinsam für sie kämpfen, wird sie uns irgendwann vereinen.
Heute Ihre Ausreise